Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for finding this and hiking all the way out from the basement. And it was a long haul, and there's coffee to be had. My name's Cameron Burke. I'm the managing director for the tech sector at PwC, and I am thrilled to moderate this conversation today on a topic that I think with the panel we have here, you'll see come at this topic of BC is the perfect place to build a tech company from a variety of perspectives. I think we're going to challenge that topic as well, because I'm sure if there's some entrepreneurs in the room, all of you have seen the highs and the lows of running a tech company here in BC. If you told me 10 years ago that there'd be a tech conference in BC of this size and scale and ambition, I would not have believed you. When I started my first company a long time ago, 2004, tech was very much an afterthought. I think it was an afterthought in the economy, and it was an afterthought in career ambitions, and certainly for investors. And so much has changed in the past decade, and we're going to dig into some of that today. Today, the tech sector in BC generates over $26 billion a year. Total employees, about 150,000, which is, well, the fastest growing tech sector in Canada, and the sector now employs more people than the mining, oil and gas, and forestry sectors combined. Now, maybe we take that for granted, but that's an enormous evolution in a very short period of time. So as it relates to BC, I'd say the combination of a really vibrant early stage ecosystem, the continued growth of brands like Amazon, Microsoft, Sony, generous government grants and incentives should result in the perfect place to raise a tech company, to raise parents, to grow a tech company. And so this is what we're going to get into today. What makes the BC tech ecosystem so unique? Is it the perfect place to build a tech company? And if it isn't, why and how can we do it better? So we have a diverse panel to tackle this topic today, made up of global brands, homegrown success stories, service companies responding to the realities of scaling tech companies in BC. And before I get into that, I just wanted to ask the audience a question. How many people in the room have started a company, show of hands, have started a company in BC? Okay, excellent. How many have worked for a started here in BC? Okay, so a lot of this is going to feel you're going to live this experience, hopefully. And so really appreciate you guys coming in today. So let me just do a quick introduction of our panelists. In the middle here, Jesse Doherty is a general manager for Amazon, manager of web services, and a leader of Amazon's Vancouver sites. So definitely brings a unique perspective to this conversation. Jesse has worked on a wide variety of tech products in his career, developed productivity software, development framework, security technology, and cloud services. Common theme is that he loves making software. Originally from Vancouver, he spent almost 10 years at Microsoft down in Washington State before returning to his hometown here to lead the growth of Amazon's Vancouver office. A timely addition to the panel, and we really appreciate his inclusion. Jesse's passionate about bringing global opportunities to Vancouver and keeping the best and the brightest talent here. Emily Key, there we go. Hi, Emily. Emily is a growth-focused operations leader. Emily has founded and scaled a top-tier development shop here in BC that was acquired in 2014. She then joined Bench, where in her role of VP Operations, she led the company through a 3-year period from 50 people to 300 through a raise of $50 million, a very critical point in any tech company's trajectory. She has recently founded a new non-for-profit called Shiny Objects that delivers STEM-focused education for kids. I think Emily and her husband want to stay in Vancouver and help more tech companies grow and scale, something I feel passionately about as well. Michael Tippett. Michael has founded several technology companies, including Now Public, Emmy-nominated pioneer of crowdsourced journalism that was acquired in 2009. He's held senior roles at Hootsuite and executive director of GrowLab. Today, Michael is ridiculously busy, founder and leader of 3 different companies, founder of One2, the CEO of .eco registry, and also runs TrueNorth, an advisory service firm that helps US tech companies set up shop here in Canada. Rebecca Troelstra, CEO and co-founder of Avenue, a high-growth startup here, started in New Westminster, 6-person company in New Westminster, now 60, growing rapidly, is growing incredibly quickly. Rebecca has a wide variety of opportunities and roles throughout the years. Classic small business hustle from catering to recruitment, and she founded Avenue alongside her husband when they identified a need in the real estate sector. And finally, certainly not least, Jack Newton, CEO of Clio, a company that I have a huge amount of time and respect for the way they've built their brand and their business in Burnaby, leading provider of cloud-based practice management software for lawyers and small legal practitioners around the world. Clio has received numerous awards, recognizing for its outstanding corporate culture, for being one of the fastest and most innovative technology companies worldwide. Jack is also the president of the Legal Cloud Computing Association. So hopefully the topics we're going to cover today will resonate with your experiences. So I'm now going to awkwardly leave the podium and join way down there to get into the questions. So I'm going to start, I think, with Emily. Yeah. Oh yeah, you need the mic. So we're talking about the BC tech ecosystem, what makes it unique, what's its strengths, what its weaknesses, but curious, I guess, both to you and Jack, what makes BC's ecosystem unique? I mean, you can be as broad as you'd like, but just from your perspective, what makes our tech ecosystem so unique?
I think there's certainly what I've experienced, the most obvious is being in the same kind of time zone as San Francisco. I think there's a lot to be, there's a lot of value there. We've got this whole Cascadia, which I think is just amazing, that whole initiative, and there's really great companies that kind of flock to the coast, so there's that. I think that's a really advantageous thing to consider, particularly for talent. Access to capital, I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more. That's an interesting one. I wouldn't say, I'll say it makes it's unique here, a little bit to be improved upon perhaps. And then I think just there's a social focus in a lot of organizations that start on the West Coast, which I think is really, really neat. Particularly, I see that in Vancouver. People want to do good and build software for good, and I think that that's a really great place to do that. And there's a lot of exciting opportunities with companies here to do that. And talent. I mean, everyone will answer talent, and I think it's really great. There's again, we talked this morning a little bit before we started the panel, and there's some pros and cons to starting businesses here, and unique. It's city to city, and I think there's a lot to consider when we're talking about what sets us apart from the rest. I think that's hotly debated.
Yeah. Definitely.
I think there's a lot that we need to improve upon, and so I think we're unique in that way, that there's people hungry to do it. Lots of cool companies, great talent, and a hunger to make change for the better, for sure.
Excellent. So Jack, I don't know if any of you have been to the Clio HQ in Burnaby, an incredible space, growing rapidly, obviously, other than living here. I mean, same question to you. There's got to be a number of reasons why you founded and kept the company here. So what makes our ecosystem unique in your opinion?
So I'll underscore one of the comments Emily had, which I think the geography of Vancouver gives us a really unique advantage over many other places in Canada and many places in the US, where the proximity to venture funds, which are obviously primarily based in the Bay Area. It's these days, it's very interesting for me. I've been building Clio for 10 years now. Over the course of those 10 years, the mentality of VCs has shifted from, we really prefer to invest kind of in our backyard to a total willingness to invest in a place like Vancouver, at least. I think there's some more distant cities that in Canada that they squint at and have a harder time with, but 2.5-hour flight, same time zone, all of those factors I think really help connect Vancouver very closely to where the money is in the valley. And I think the talent pool that's in Vancouver in particular and Canada in general is one of our more unique advantages. And when I contrast that with the talent pool in the Valley, for example, you see a lot of people that are, just churn over tremendously. There's an enormous amount of employee turnover. People kind of wait for their first or second year vesting date and pick up their next lottery ticket at whatever the next company they're going to in terms of stock options. And you see just way more loyalty to companies I think in Vancouver in particular, and I think it's kind of a Canadian thing. I look back at our first 10 hires at Clio, and 8 of them are still with us almost a decade later, and that's pretty incredible. They're in senior leadership positions and having a huge impact on the company. So I think that's a really unique advantage that Vancouver has to offer, is that the employee retention and an enormously broad and deep talent pool. Now there's unique challenges as well. It's not all unique advantages. The access to seasoned executive talent, for example, is extremely limited. When I say, I want to look for a sales executive that's grown a SaaS company from $50 million to $100 million in revenues, that list of people in Vancouver is vanishingly small, if it exists at all. And that's a really significant and unique challenge that I think there's ways to address, but is, as Emily said, no small feat to overcome.
So just a quick follow-on on that. In that 10-year period, have you noticed a change in the employees, sort of the new employees that come through Clio? Is there a different perspective? One of the things the reason I ask is with my first company, I was certainly never embarrassed of founding a company here, but you always got questions in the U.S. Why are you there? Why aren't you in Seattle? Or why aren't you in San Francisco? Why aren't you somewhere else doing this? And I feel like there's a confidence and a different perspective on how Vancouver fits into the global context that is different than when I came through. So curious, do you see that reflected at all in new employees coming through Clio?
I think there's an increased willingness for people to relocate either to Vancouver or Toronto than there was 10 years ago. There's more options on the table. I mentioned Toronto in the same breath, by the way. One of the strategies that we've used at Clio is, I think, to really tap into the full potential that the Canadian market has to offer. You actually probably need more than one office, at least today. That might not be the case in another 5 years, but I don't think we would have been able to grow as quickly as we have and get the kind of overall quality of people we could have without multiple hiring locations within Canada.
Great, thanks for that. Jesse and Michael, this question's for you. In terms of taking a gauge of the health of the BC, and I'm also going to throw in, I spend a lot of time in Calgary and Edmonton as well, and I think there's an increasingly vibrant tech ecosystem, certainly in artificial intelligence in certain areas. So in terms of the health of our Western Canadian, call it for the sake of the question, tech ecosystem, where do you feel we're at right now? And maybe Jesse, I'll start with you.
I think we're at a pretty exciting stage. I don't know how to gauge health so much, but the way I would think about it is opportunity. Amazon is growing here because of talent. I like the mix of a lot of really talented, excited people and a great place to live and a very welcoming culture. Those all mixed together make a really exciting opportunity or a place to grow. One thing I think is really interesting here is that in the past, Vancouver has had a limited number of really what I would call global impact opportunities to work on something that will literally be used by everyone on the planet. And I think you only need a few of those in an area to really unlock its potential. And that's one of the things I like about what we're doing here is we can start to create opportunities in Vancouver for people who perhaps have moved away or would think about moving away soon, instead to stay, build their skills here, take on interesting projects that will have global impact, develop a lot of the muscles that Jack was mentioning to kind of grow a project to that scale. And then, we're realistic that people may, Amazon's awesome, but people may decide at some point to experiment, do something else, and then join the startup ecosystem. So to me, I feel like it's got a lot of the ingredients in place for a lot of really interesting growth in the coming years.
Great.
Yeah, I would echo that actually, and I think it's great that Amazon is expanding their operations here. I think the way I see it is that I think, and I've been in the tech scene here for 20 years, and trust me, it's a lot different than it was back then. But I think what we have now is we have the kind of fundamental building blocks for a healthy ecosystem. So we've got a kind of a robust early stage startup ecosystem. We've got a lot of great accelerators. We've got some of the world's best universities and design schools. We've got the kind of infrastructure that a lot of people are looking for when they're looking to start a life. We've got great healthcare. We've got great schools. We've got all those sort of things that I think we take for granted as Canadians. But if you talk to people in, say, Silicon Valley, it's a big concern, where their kid's going to go to school. So I think we have a lot of those building blocks. And I think what is interesting about companies like Microsoft and Amazon starting to have a bigger footprint here is that they are kind of building connective tissue that brings a lot of those things together. One of the things that I've observed in my time here is that particularly the point was made earlier about the sort of lack of senior leadership talent in the city. And I think that's in some ways a function of the fact that, if you're that senior sales executive that's taken a $50 million company to a $100 million company, there's probably 1 or 2 jobs for you in the city, right? Whereas in Seattle or San Francisco or New York or Berlin or London or wherever you're thinking of going to next, there's probably a dozen. And so your likelihood of sticking around is lower. And so even if you are able to find someone, and I saw this at Hootsuite all the time, you can bring them up from some of those cities. They'll come, they'll work for a couple of years, and if they decide to leave, there's nowhere for them to go after that. And we see that in the tech sector. I do a lot of work with universities. We see that with professors and super talented people. So to have that kind of resilience and diversity in those larger organizations, I think is really going to help to improve that situation.
That's great. So, Rebecca, I love your story because Realty Butler at the time, founded in New Westminster, classic hustle, tech startup, whether you knew it was a tech startup then or not, but you're seeing this great, very quick, rapid trajectory. So curious on, it's exciting to be in that phase of growth, and it feels like it's just a magic moment in time. So on the flip side of that, like what concerns, so you're as an early stage startup growing quickly, what are the concerns you have over the next few years about how you continue that growth? And maybe you can tie it to some of the specifics in BC, whether it be talent or other things.
I think right now for Avenue, the big challenge is how do we scale properly? We're seeing incredible growth, and in that very exciting phase, it's when everything starts breaking, and you have to figure out how do I do this for 10 times, 100 times the clients, 1,000 times the clients. And so it's a very exciting time. I think specific to BC, the challenge that we're facing is we are putting in that senior level of leadership at the moment. We're in a position where we're finally able to do that. And finding the right talent in the city, as you were mentioning, it can be hard to find the right person. You don't get a lot, and you don't need everybody to be super experienced, but you need somebody who at least understands the direction you're trying to go in. And so especially for the much more difficult roles like CTO, director of people, those that are a little bit tougher and very niche, we don't have a lot of options. And I think that's the biggest challenge is let's find the right people. Specific to BC, obviously there's all the other challenges like finding the right space. And when you're a quickly growing startup, how do you make sure you have enough space in the next 6 months? And but it's also a very exciting challenge to continue to challenge or to tackle every day. So
Emily, I guess following on that point, what else can small and mid-sized companies do who are now competing for talent with bigger brands and who maybe can pay more? But beyond compensation, I feel like there's a lot of other factors that companies can use to attract and retain talent. So curious if there's anything you've seen or have any thoughts around that companies can use to keep that talent.
Lots of things. I think making sure you're solving challenging problems. I think there's a lot of companies out there that they have a great story and are really trying to change the world. And I think if there are a lot of people out there who want to sink their teeth into something really meaningful. And that's a great way to engage great talent and retain that talent. I think I feel like this wasn't on my list of questions, but I'm happy to answer it.
Surprise.
I want to add on to what Rebecca's talking about, though, because we went through a similar thing at Bench, and it is really hard to find the talent. But I also, if we're going to talk about, paying a headhunting firm in the States $150,000 retainer to go search for that executive, and then we're going to pay them the 18 to 20% of their salary as that headhunting fee.
Yeah.
Let's just call it $250,000 to find that person in the States who's done what we want them to do. We can be really creative with $250,000 US and investing in training in people here. We could be really creating weird and wacky partnerships. That's a lot of degrees and professional development for people who are here, who want to be here, who are interested. And I don't think it's about, oh, don't bring them up, they're taking our jobs. That's not what I think at all. But I do think that we get stressed and there's not a lot of time, and we're like, here, let's go, let's do this, find this person who's done it before. And I think I've seen that go really well, and I've seen it go really poorly as well. And there's a lot of great hungry people here who have that skill set, and they need to be engaged and mentored and coached by people, here at this conference. I think that's really important. I don't believe in the perks, the Silicon Valley perks. I don't think those are, you guys know what I'm talking about, like, meals and beer on tap and that kind of stuff. I think that's really great, but I personally, I'm a mother of 2 children. Beer on Friday at 4 is not my jam.
At the
thank
office.
you for the laugh, the one laugh, thank you. At the office, yeah, sorry.
At the office. Yeah, clear.
I'll see you at the wine bar. And I think there's a lot of other things we need to be doing. I think in a lot of the engagement surveys that we had done at Bench when I was there, the feedback that I got from majority of our workforce, which was, I would say, in their 20s, was that they wanted learning and development opportunities, and they wanted a career development track. That was it. That was the constant want. And I think it's really hard and really challenging for a rapidly growing startup to provide those things, because they're just trying to get shit done.
Yep.
And it goes low on the priority list. So there was my swear. They were betting whether or not I would swear.
Before the panel, we had a debate about who was going to swear first, and Emily said she was going to swear first.
Check.
She did.
Yes. East Coast girl, yes.
Yeah, I represent.
So I don't know if I kind of roundabout answered your question. I think you have to care about the people in your organization. It can't just be about the bottom line. It has to be, you want clients in the door, and if you want clients in the door, you have to have really happy and engaged employees and be treating them well and investing in them and their development. And that's the way that we're going to grow tech here. I really believe that.
Well, it wasn't your answer.
Can I add to that?
No.
I think definitely I get it. It's when you're a small to medium-sized startup that's growing very quickly, I completely understand where the focus, it gets taken away from what is it like for the people who work here. And every book you read, they're like, oh, getting to that 50 person and beyond, like between 50 and 100 is the hardest time, because you lose all your culture and you lose all your values. And I'm so proud that as a company we've made that one of our top priorities. And because you're joining a family, essentially, where people are incredibly passionate about what they do, and you want the people who work for you to feel the same way. And the only way they're going to do that is if they have shared values, if they have clarity on where they're headed. And I know that that's very hard for a startup to do, but especially if you're trying to attract talent, it's so important to do that the right way. And not just kind of a like, yeah, I mean, it's a nice thing to have. We wrote up a booklet. Here you go. It's an actual, how do we live this every day? How do we call out people within the company who do this? And like basic things like we recognize team members every Monday morning, and we say, here's how you stood out last week, and here's how you embodied our values. And things like that are the things that really matter to people. And if you don't emphasize that, and I know it's hard to keep that as a focus when you're growing so fast, you're going to start either losing talent or not being able to find the right kind of talent. So,
yeah, no.
Being flexible and growing with them, I think they're growing and going through different life stages. It's not all about one segment and catering to the 20 to 25-year-olds, right? It's about, okay, you're a parent, you have kids, what does that look like? How can we make this work for you? And I think being really open to that. And I think that's an advantage of having a smaller company, is we're able to do that and be, I know, Jack, you guys do some amazing stuff and really demonstrating that that's what we value. I think, and Rick from Unbounce, right? He took parental leave. I don't know very many gentlemen who are CEOs of companies who take parental leave, but he demonstrated that, and I think that's so crucial, and I'd love to see that more as well.
Yeah, agreed. I want to move on to something we all deal with at various points in our businesses, which is financing. I touched on in my intro sort of how much the ecosystem has changed over the last 10 years, but maybe Jack, for you and Rebecca, curious on, do you feel that the venture capital, alternative investment, however you want to classify it, space has evolved has evolved as much during that same period of time? Or what's your experience been like raising money in BC to grow a tech company?
So for me, it's hard to talk about, the change of climate in BC separate from the macro environment that's changed pretty substantially in the same time period. We raised our first $1 million in 2009, 2010, which was, as I'm sure many of you recall, not the greatest fundraising climate in the world. It was, people were legitimately worried about the financial system as we knew it collapsing. And we were trying to raise money in that environment, and it was super difficult. We talked to tons of Canadian VC firms. We got some, frankly, really shitty lowball offers that were just laughably bad. We said no to them. We talked to a lot of great US VCs who were just not writing checks because they were scared the economy, we knew it was going to collapse. And then we ended up taking our first $1 million from a German-based VC named Christoph Jans that cold emailed us one day and just said, "I love what you guys are building, can I invest?" And he was not actually a VC at that point, he was an angel investor. We were the second company he invested in. The company immediately prior, his first investment was a company called Zendesk, when it was 4 guys in Copenhagen that he invested in. So we had a really, really difficult time raising that first round. A lot of the US-based VCs that we talked to at that point, the discourse was very much, can you guys relocate the company to the Bay Area? If not the Bay Area, maybe Seattle. Is that close enough that you could kind of, just call it your new headquarters? And we were kind of like, no, we really want to build a Canadian company. By the time we were raising our Series B in 2014, the landscape had really changed. US investors were more than happy to invest in Canada. And then finally our latest round, which we raised in 2015, led by Bessemer Venture Partners, they actually not only are willing to invest in Canada, but have a thesis that investing in Canadian companies and other international locales is a competitive advantage for them, that every VC is looking in their backyard and they dig out the Shopifys of the world way earlier than other VCs and see a great return as a result. So I've seen a really dramatic change over that 10 years, a real willingness to invest in Canada. And in the meantime, I think we've seen Canadian VCs step up to the bat in a much better way and give more competitive term sheets. And Inovia just raised a huge round. There's Georgian Partners. There's tons of great firms in BC and Canada, all the way from seed stage to late stage, that are real contenders now. So I think it's a great time to be raising capital today. Multiples are amazing. Tons of competition for deals, and there's probably never been a better time to raise money in Vancouver or elsewhere.
That's great. But Rebecca, what about you?
I'm kind of on the opposite spectrum of where you're at. That we've kind of just wrapped up our seed round, and
the first million is the hardest.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what I've heard a lot from Canadian VCs specifically is that VCs in Canada are very eager to invest in companies, but they're not stepping up to invest in the huge companies. So the ones that have the billion-dollar potential are not necessarily the ones that get funded by Canadian VCs. The fortunate part is that people in the Valley are seeing Vancouver, and it's no longer, well, there's a border there, I don't know. That's not a consideration anymore, so they're open to larger rounds, which is really helpful. What I've heard from Valley VCs is I've heard a lot of, when you're a Canadian company, we do put you through extra scrutiny, though. And we do want to make sure that your numbers are right. And I've heard that from quite a few people because it is a little bit more of an unknown landscape. But I do think it is a prime time in BC specifically if you're looking to grow a company where investors are eager and they've seen the potential and the excitement in this market right now. So it's
Great.
It's great.
This one, I want to dig a little bit into access. Everyone's touched on talent and access to talent. So for Jesse, we had an interesting conversation around how universities can potentially play a bigger role in improving our talent pool. So I was curious on your thoughts around how the universities in BC can support and play potentially a more engaged, aggressive role in the evolution of BC tech.
Sure. I see it as kind of having two dimensions. Throughput, meaning I think we need to widen the lanes and just have more seats available for STEM investments in all the universities, which is a provincial and university collaboration that needs to be worked through. Today, universities have to trade off between schools to decide where to put seats, and that keeps the tech seats narrow. So we just need more. I think that's number one. We need to reach back into the elementary schools and actually find talent locally to go into the universities. Kind of accept the fact that we've got lots of bright kids all over the province that really should get an opportunity to receive this education. To me, it's personally really important that we find ways to give people who generally don't have access to this type of education access to really great STEM training. Diversity is important because it brings better ideas to the table. You get a better perspective on your products when you're looking at it from lots of different points of view. And when you have a global marketplace, that's only helpful. So diversity is actually a better strategy for building products. And so I think we need to provide access to education to people who don't generally get it. And then finally, I think technology moves really quickly. And I think it's important for the universities, and I spend time with each of the universities to help with this, is I think it's be willing to experiment in curriculum and lean forward on the type of things we teach in order to differentiate the region itself. And I use one kind of really obvious example, and this isn't meant to be negative about schools, but when I went to school, we were really excited if the software worked once. We're like, wow, you handed that in, you got your grade. But that's unfortunately not how software works in the real world, right? We have to maintain it on an ongoing basis. It's a utility now. And so starting to lean forward and start to think about what's it like to teach students what it's like to receive someone else's code, advance it, respect the ideas that came before, make them better. It's a very different style of learning than I think you get out of pure theoretical computer science. And so my summary is, let's make the lanes wider. Let's lean forward on curriculum and be willing as a region to take some risks there, right? And let's connect it to earlier education so that we've got more on-ramps for people who don't have access to that kind of education today.
Well, so how do companies of all sizes support that? And how would you recommend they speak to various levels of government to push and universities to support that agenda?
How? I mean, not to give public policy advice, but
No.
I mean, our government is there just to go speak to, so I would really recommend for a lot of the tech leaders here to make it part of what you advocate for, right? A lot of tech leaders are advocates for things they care strongly about. I think keep in mind that the structure and form of our education system is an important part of our tech ecosystem. And so develop an opinion, get involved, talk to your provincial and federal folks. And then, the universities are incredibly open to engagement as well. We have programs where obviously we have internship programs where we bring in students who get to write real world software with really experienced engineers. They get a lot out of that. We also have programs where we have engineers in our schools go to the universities and do guest professorships. They do mentoring programs where they mentor professors and students together. There's a lot of opportunities for the companies themselves to just dedicate a little bit of their own advocacy towards this.
No, that's great. For Michael, TrueNorth, and we're having a conversation around, and one of the great things I think Amazon and other companies are doing is keeping good talent here locally, attracting people back, the Canadian diaspora back home, if you will. But you play a pretty key role in that talent conversation, Michael. So curious on your thoughts on, do we have access to great talent here? How would you rank Vancouver and BC's talent pool compared to, let's make it a Canadian context. How would you rate our talent?
That's a big question. I mean, I think our universities are globally competitive. You look at UBC or Emily Carr or SFU, and these are top universities globally, within the top 10 or 20 universities in the world. So I think we have exceptional graduates. A lot of those graduates end up leaving as they are, handing in their fourth-year essay or project. Amazon or Google is at the door asking them to come down to Seattle or Silicon Valley. So I think there's a challenge in making sure that the investment we make in education stays in the region. But I think, from that perspective, we have world-class talent. I think we have the kind of culture here that fosters experimentation and kind of like the sort of wacky, innovative thinking that is helpful in an early stage startup community. And I've run accelerators and I've seen those people, and I think we have a lot of that, and I think that's a critical piece of it. I think the missing piece is that sort of more senior level. That I think is where we can improve, and I'm hoping that larger companies that are coming to the region will help us with that. But I think Vancouver and Canada, generally speaking, to the people I speak with all over the world, but certainly in the States, is seen as a place that people want to come. I think the States was that for a while, but I think if you're from Southeast Asia, or you're from the Middle East, or you're from Africa, or you're the next Elon Musk, if you're coming from a different place, Vancouver and Canada is a much more attractive place than the States is now, and we're starting to see this in terms of the numbers of engineers and people who are reluctant to stay or go to the States. And I think Vancouver and Canada is uniquely positioned as a welcoming place, and I think we can't underestimate the value of that when we're seeking world-class talent.
So let's dig into that a bit. Let's call it for the Trump effect, if you will. How do we make this moment in time more than just a reaction to bad news somewhere else? Like, what do we need to do to cement Canada as a top destination for top talent globally? Is it enough to be different than somewhere else? Or is there more we can do to make sure that these people don't just come here and wait for a new administration or a new legislative reality and decide to pack up their bags and leave? So what do we need to do to cement that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a if you're thinking broadly in terms of what government can do at various levels, I think we need to play the long game, and I think we need to, as Canadians, kind of buy into the long-term vision of what this country stands for, and we need to support culture. We need to make sure that we don't have massive income disparity. That's going to be a massive issue, especially as things like automation start to become more of a factor. I think we need to encourage and foster diversity, both for good social reasons as well as for good business reasons. I think Jesse's absolutely right. I think diversity is a key ingredient in building good product. And I think those are the sorts of things that we've done in the history of our country, and I think we just need to kind of keep our eye on the ball and think long term. And if we do that, we will build something that is sustainable in the long run. That's great.
Jesse, do you have?
I think it was Emily who said earlier that one thing that engineers really, really like or really need is a career path, being able to see a future. And I think of that in terms of learning, right, more so than titles. So I think one way to sustain the region when you bring people here or when you have people who have started off here is to make sure that there are lots and lots of learning opportunities for those people in the industry. The industry has a nice mix of job types and challenges at different scales. And I think that mix is super important to the success. So I think it requires not only larger companies to come in, but then to be surrounded by startups that may be spin-offs from the large companies. And we see this when we go when Amazon builds a larger office in a place, we've observed and have measured the effect where you can see startups starting to form around it and that ecosystem forming. And so we're excited that we see that coming here as well.
So I want to touch on that with Emily and Rebecca. As companies, larger companies pull talent in, what can smaller, mid-sized companies do to not compete for the talent, because we touched on that, but how do they compete and scale? I mean, we talked about this earlier today. I think it's clear we have a vibrant tech ecosystem, early stage startup ecosystem. I think historically BC has struggled to scale companies. So as we see shining examples of innovation and growth globally coming here and building, let me rephrase that. What do you think BC companies need to do going forward to compete and to really ramp up the scale aspect?
I think it's part of it is it's a very different position to be at the scaling phase at that very beginning where you're trying to appropriately grow, and then there's the companies that have grown and there's new challenges. And where we're currently finding a lot of talent is the people who've been through that, and you know, the bench accounting, the Hootsuite. We ran into people who say, I was here through the growth, loved it, I want to go back to that. And so that's been really helpful for us because we're saying, we're right here. But we also want to believe in people who haven't been through that phase and who are at the beginning of their careers and who are saying, I want the opportunity to be able to grow a company from 50 to 500 people. And so I think a lot of it is we need to be very careful about how we put job descriptions out there. We really need to think about what is it that you're asking for, especially when we're talking about diversity, not only in gender, but in ethnicity. I think what we do is we write a default job description and we don't realize that, for example, it is proven that women apply for jobs very differently than men. Men will apply for jobs, this is a total generalization, but that it's proven that men will apply for jobs where they're like, yeah, you know, I can kind of do some of that, so I'll apply for it. Whereas women will say, I do not have direct experience with this, so they don't apply. So the way we word our job descriptions, the way we reach out to diverse cultures. I was reading an article by Slack the other day about how they used to do their dev tests in the office, and they just put a developer, they'd say, okay, here's a whiteboard, how would you do this? And they realized that they were isolating especially different ethnicities because their general working style doesn't work that way. And so, and they were uncomfortable with their English skills, so they felt like they lost at that moment. And so they changed their policy based on that. And so really thinking about how am I asking people to apply for jobs? What am I doing during the interview process that could be isolating certain people? I love the fact that Slack, for example, asks all of the same questions for one role in every interview so that they can actually compare answers. Instead of like, what questions do you think you should ask? They're all arranged and pre-written beforehand. A big thing we do is we don't have the complexity that Slack does. We don't track these analytics as closely. When we put people through interview processes, we actually put people through 4 interviews, and each one has a very different topic. The first one is, are you value aligned? And we have one person who does it, and it's the same person every time. And so they are able to give the same answers. And then there's different categories for each interview, but I think really thinking through how you bring people onto your team will attract the right talent.
So are we missing a whole segment of talent that we're just, you know, to your point, there was a great conversation. For some of you in the room who saw Jody Kovitz last night speak on Move the Dial and how to get more female participation in tech, it was a great conversation, and Women Who Tech was a great conversation as well. So, and I'll put this up for whoever wants to touch on it. Jack, perhaps yourself, and Emily as well. How can we get more, how can we attract and keep more women in tech? I mean, we've all been through companies, and all of a sudden you look around one day and you realize we're not, you know, this is not a very diverse group of guys sitting around here talking about the same things. And I think that conversation has evolved greatly. At the same point, I think it's just more opinions create better products, better culture, more opportunity. So what have you seen work, and how can we attract more women into tech?
I think someone said diversity is good for building products, which I totally agree with. It's also just the right thing to do. It's not about having a group. I mean, and hey, this is a great, we're a little gender diverse here, but we're certainly not ethnically diverse. We are not representative of those that are trying to grow and grow businesses here in BC, and I think we would be remiss to not acknowledge that. In terms of what we do to attract more women, they're there, and they're, it's interesting, you probably have all heard of Ellen Pao and Tracy Chow, and they're in the Bay Area, and they started something called Project Include, and they actually were huge in sparking this conversation and putting the call out for some of these larger organizations to share their diversity numbers, their D&I numbers, let's call it. And what's interesting is in the past few years, not much has changed. The biggest change that we see is that some VCs, like a quarter of all the VC firms out there, have added maybe their first female partner. And that's the largest change that we've seen. So I think we can talk about it all day, and we talk about why. And I love that you're asking the question of what is it we should do. I would put it to the gentlemen on the panel who are building massive businesses. What are you doing? I think often the onus is on women to not only go and find these roles and be amazing, extra amazing at the roles because they're often doubted, and to also run amazing organizations and be on boards and be mentoring other women and work with the Raise Collective who are investing in women and work with female founders, and they're out there and doing this, and I don't see the same from our male counterparts all the time, and I think we need to do more. Less talk, more action. And so I would love to hear, Jack, I know you guys are doing some great work and at Amazon as well. You guys are adding how many people? 3,000? Are they going to be women? Because that will not even make up for the demographic discrepancy. So what are we doing?
Yeah, so I'll take some of the heat off, Jesse. So,
thank you. Sorry.
No, it's a great question, and I think, look, it's something we could talk another hour about because I think it's a really important issue, and I'll do my best to cram into 2 minutes. But I think we talk about diversity. I think about diversity as a scorecard. This is like how well you've done in terms of creating an inclusive work environment, which is what I think you ultimately need to be focusing your energy on. And I think there's a lot of great selfish reasons that companies should build diverse teams, like all the scientific literature that demonstrates they perform better and everything else. But to get there, I think a lot of companies struggle with, how do I get there? Do I need a hiring quota for for a certain ratio of females and so on, which of course you can't really do.
Sure you can.
Well,
You're doing it at PwC.
You putting me on the spot right now?
No, but
Okay,
the stake has to go in the ground, right?
Our approach is, look, it's got to be a bit of a deeper investment in, number one, I think, especially technology companies, creating the inclusive work environment that females want to work at. Moving away from the the programmer kind of environment. You talk about beer taps, even something as simple as that. Is it a bunch of guys hanging around playing video games at end of work Friday that might send this subtle signal to females that aren't into that they're not as welcomed or as included in the group. I think when we look at technology hiring overall, though, I mean, your comment that the women are out there is true, but it's also just a fact that my computer science graduating class was 120 men and 2 females. And female attendance in STEM programs has dropped dramatically every year since the 1970s. And we need to be making a longer term investment. It's one of the things we put a lot of energy into Clio is we host Girls Learning Code, for example, every month at our office, and we have volunteers from the office, a bunch of folks from the product development floor put on programming for anywhere from 8 to 12-year-old girls to get them exposed to programming and interested in technology. And again, hopefully, planting a memory that they'll be able to think of as they enter their teenage years that, that technology company was actually a cool place that I could imagine myself working at. And I think the root problem is that we just have a lot of females entering university where they're trying to get the training that, yes, we need more of all of those graduates, but the composition of females higher up in the funnel needs to go way up. And sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting because a lot of the easy thing is to say that the pipeline is the problem. And so there's a really well-known technology company here in town, and I've seen their numbers in terms of their makeup. And it's pretty even across the board until you get to the engineering manager level. And then there's a dramatic drop-off. And so I think there's this, again, I talk about Rick who took parental leave, right? Like women are still, I'm obviously generalizing, but it is still in most cases are the ones who are taking time away from their career. And we see that in the numbers. You get to that manager director level, and that's coincidentally the same time people are going and taking leave. And so I think we need to have better mat leave policies or parental leave policies. We need to do a way better job there. And again, we talk about that flexibility and what does the 9 to 5, commuting an hour and working 9 to 5 and then commuting an hour home isn't going to work. So what are we doing differently? And is it remote work, or is it, 3/4 time, or what does that look like? We have to get really creative there as well. And so I think I know you've been really embracing that, and a few companies in town are doing it. And I would say, wield your power and put a stake in the ground and try something. Test. Yep. If you pitch something as a test, it's really hard to say no, right?
It's got to be a mix of, the short-term tactics that I think will create a more favorable work environment and create the kind of flexibility that you need. I think it's, and then some of these longer-term plays where the pipeline does need to be improved.
Okay, well, that was a good question. I like that topic. We could probably talk about it for another 60 minutes. I wanted to just bring up a couple of things as it relates to scale. And all of these things flow back into how can we more effectively, more inclusively grow and scale tech companies. Again, for Jesse, you have an interesting perch on scale, a very global perspective. And we had a conversation earlier this morning around, at a certain level, senior talent is really a global talent, and they're looking at roles in Vancouver and Berlin and other places. So, curious on when you bring senior talent from around the world to Vancouver, what is their perspective? Do those new employees view Vancouver as a stop for a while, or is it? Is there an opportunity to keep great talent here in BC for the long term?
Well, I don't know that I have a sample size that's large enough to draw a strong conclusion from, so maybe I'll just draw on my own experience. Having lived away for a number of years and wanting to come home, I found it really challenging to find something that I thought would be like an interesting challenge, something to try and take on next. And I think it's really common in senior folks that they're not necessarily thinking about title or career or something as much as challenge or something big to do, like something structural or fundamental that you can change. And the company's become a way of doing that, as opposed to something that I would look at as kind of slightly more careerist, like oh geez, I want to become a senior executive of some sort. And I found that it was actually quite challenging to do that. But I wanted to be here because I like the area and because I'm from here. And so I think that creating the opportunities for senior people to come here means creating those challenges, those interesting opportunities. When we do talk to people that are considering the area, it's usually because they already like the idea of being here. It's attractive to them, they like the region. And it's usually about the questions on their minds are usually related to, is there going to be something really interesting to do? And then they usually mention things related to the region's cost of living.
Right.
Can we retain them? That's really a question of whether or not you can maintain, or the way I like to think about it is, can you give them the opportunity to create the future challenges that they will then unlock? Can they become part of the ability to scale themselves? And if you can give them enough runway and have enough resources to enable that, then you can create a long-term path for them.
No, that's great. I know we are up against the clock here, so I wanted to, not necessarily a closing question, if you will, but I guess, Michael, and I'll take this quickly from all of you. If we're here a year from now, what's one thing you want to see change in the BC ecosystem over the next year?
I'd like to see 15 more companies like Amazon show up.
Hear, hear.
I'd like to see more female-founded companies and a diverse representation of what our demographics actually are in Vancouver and BC.
I'd like to see at least twice as many STEM seats in the universities and much more creative curriculum through elementary, advanced degrees in the region.
I agree with you. As the mother of a 4-year-old daughter, I would like to see it go all the way back to kindergarten and really make it a part of our education to learn, boys and girls, all of the dev and technology, because we really need to change the way we're educating people. We're ill-equipped come when we finish high school.
I'd like to see a technology company IPO
Yes.
out of Vancouver. We need that.
Yeah. No, that's a great cross-section. You know, I'm passionate about, not that I'm on the panel, but I'm just going to include myself right now. Am I? Okay, I'm on the panel. Scaling to me, I know I've touched on it and I probably ad nauseum, but I feel like there's, Rebecca touched on something a bit earlier around when you're growing, who do you ask? How do you, scaling is sort of figuring it out on the fly. And I see it's great to get together with a group of people who have been through this journey and who have so much to share with other people of just that journey through scaling. Like, how does lead generation work? What kind of financing should I avoid? When do I need a board? When do I not need a board? All of these questions are the ones that kept me up at night. It wasn't disruption. It wasn't, you know, big things. It was the little things that I had never done before that terrified me. And you'd seek out answers all over the place. So I think these kind of forums where people are honest and frank and helpful, I think that's, in my experience, has been a really nice feature of our ecosystem. It's been pretty collaborative. I want to make sure that keeps, that's as we grow, that remains. And I also really want to thank this panel. I think it was a really interesting conversation, a great cross-section of small companies, enormous companies, and everything in between. And thanks for your honesty and for your transparency. And thank you guys for coming through.